You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Offensive lineman James Daniels might not be the Chicago Bears' biggest name free agent set to hit the open market, but the contract he ends up getting could end up being the most lucrative of any upcoming Bears free agent, at least over the course of the full contract. This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and every day. On the show today, we're going to dive in deep on James Daniels, the offensive lineman, as a free agent. Should the Chicago Bears re-sign him? Whether they can afford to re-sign him, or should they spend the money to re-sign him? They do have the salary cap space. Not logistically can they afford it, not so much literally can they afford it, but should he be a part of their plans on the offensive line moving forward? Should they go in a different direction there? And if they go into a different direction, what kind of options would they have? What kind of options could they have? And how does that all play into the plan new general manager Ryan Poles may have for his offensive line? Because James Daniels is coming off of what was definitely a bounce back season, right? 2 years ago in 2020, the first COVID year, he missed more than half of that season, I believe, with the pectoral injury. He only played like 200 snaps that season. He was on the field like for every snap he could, but then once he tore the pec, it was done for there. And so this past season was an opportunity for him to, show one more time what he could do, steady the ship a little bit, and go into free agency potentially coming off of a productive season. And with offensive linemen, it's hard to really measure that production. One of the main ways people go to is the Pro Football Focus pass blocking and run blocking grades. And I'm always very upfront about my feelings on those. I think they do measure something that we see on the field. They measure on-field production in a way, especially for offensive linemen, that we can't capture in any other metric. But I also don't think it tells the full picture. And PFF is very good about saying this too, that it's not saying this is the end-all, be-all, and the only tool you should use to determine whether or not I think a player is good or not. But it is one way to look at offensive line performance. And Daniels, over the course of his 4 seasons, got better from year to year and finished with, technically speaking, his highest PFF grade at the end of 2021. But the range of grades was very, very small. It was essentially performing almost identically across, at least in terms of grade, across each of the 4 seasons, but just a slight improvement from 18 to 19 and then from 19 to 21, given that 2020 was a much, much smaller size of 300 total snaps, about 200 pass blocking snaps, and 100 run blocking snaps. The one thing that stands out, I think, from 2021, just in terms of the raw sort of overall evaluation, is the penalties. He was, I think, the Bears' most penalized offensive lineman. He had 9 flags thrown on him this season, and that wasn't exactly what you were hoping to see from him in this stage of his career. But he also blocked pretty well, and I think got better as the year went on. Right, it was a little bit rough early on, I think, perhaps coming back from that pectoral injury. Plus, they ended up making some changes at the offensive tackle spots. They had injuries at right tackle kind of throughout the year, and then Larry Borom kind of gets in there. And once things settled down a little bit more, I think that helped too. But overall, I think you're left looking at James Daniels finishing this season as, a fine offensive lineman, a fine guard. He gets the job done, right? It's hard to sort of start to narrow it down because, right, no one's sitting here saying James Daniels top 5 guard in the NFL, right? He's not dominating, quote unquote, but he's not bad, right? He's a good starter. Like, so in that good but not great starter type range. And especially because I think you look earlier in his career, right? And what was it, 2019, I think, they started shifting him between guard and center, and it wasn't really First of all, at center, he struggled a lot with snapping the ball and getting the protections in, and it just really didn't seem like the place that he was going to belong at this point. But then, moving him back and forth between the two, it took him a little while to sort of settle in back at left guard, where he had played fairly well his rookie season. And now 2021 was a change over to right guard, which isn't drastically different, but switching from left-handed to right-handed blocking does take some time to adjust to, which again, I think is part of why we saw, I guess, steady improvement over the course of the season. It's not linear. It's not better every game than the game before. There's some ups and there's some downs along the way. But I think it put him in a position there to set himself up for a decent upcoming free agency here, especially because the other parts of the Bears offensive line weren't playing particularly well. He was picking up some of the slack, I think, for the issues at center. If you're having to help out the center, and both guards had to pay a little more attention to the center help next to them. And of course, Daniels then also had a rookie 5th round pick on his other side, which the rookie 5th round pick played well, but still it's a rookie, right? That you sort of, you have to help the rookie a little bit, have him under your wing, even if it's not always physically on every play, but just it's another thing in his mind, I think, of dealing with, okay, what's going to happen on that side. And then also schematically, we didn't necessarily feel like the Bears offense was was giving their offensive line always the requisite help it might need against blitzes and other defensive schemes to try and stunt or twist players here and there to get free home pass rushing. And yet I still come away feeling like, we didn't think this Bears offensive line was great for a lot of this season. There was some issues in the run blocking and perhaps more issues in the pass blocking. And certainly we blame the center position a bit for that. We blame some of the instability at right tackle for some of that. And, some back and Tevin Jenkins had a couple of rough moments there too, but it didn't feel like it was like specifically James Daniels' fault by any means, but was it all on the center and then some of the right tackle changes? It just felt like at times even Daniels was sometimes vulnerable. Now yet he's 20, he's still only 24 years old, right? He's going to be younger this year than some of the rookies in the upcoming NFL draft. So of course you have a young ascending offensive lineman with still untapped potential is not the right word, but still growing into his prime, right? He can still get better and is expected to continue to improve as he goes later in his career. So it raises some real questions about, okay, well, how much is that worth? Not only financially, but how much is that worth to the Bears and what they want out of the future of their offensive line? We'll look at some of the contract numbers and whether that fits into what the Bears' plan may be to surround Justin Fields with the best talent possible next on Locked On Bears. As the NFL offseason keeps rolling forward, there should be more prop bets you may able to be getting in on and have some fun with our friends at BetOnline. You're not going to see any James Daniels bets, but certainly there have been Aaron Rodgers props about what he's going to do when free agency comes around. A lot of different discussions about where players may end up that you can put some money down on. And of course, the NFL draft, who's going to be the number one overall pick, how many players are going to go, how many receivers are going to go in the first round, how many players are going to go from these schools, and so many more ways. So just because the football season's over doesn't mean the betting has to be done at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is the number one spot for all of your sports betting needs, scores, podcasts, news, and not just on football, but basketball, soccer, hockey, tennis, boxing, UFC, baseball, if they can reach a collective bargaining agreement sometime soon. Head on over to betonline.net today or use your mobile device to learn more about all the different trends and action you need to know, because BetOnline is where the game starts. I think the question for James Daniels as a Chicago Bears free agent is not, would you like to have him back? I think, yes, he's a we talking about like average to above average, maybe firmly above average this season, borderline above average. Regardless, he's a young starting quality guard, right? Of course, you would in theory like to have that back in a vacuum, but the question becomes specifically, how much is that worth to the Bears and how much is that worth to other teams around the NFL, and whether or not there's that lines up for being able to be something the Bears can pay and should pay and be willing to pay versus Daniels perhaps wanting the opportunity to explore the market and get a contract that may price him out of what the Bears could be looking for in terms of their process, because there is other changes they need to make on the offensive line. And it's this double-edged sword of, right, if James Daniels is going to command a contract that's significant, re-signing James Daniels will take money away from being able to sign another center and maybe another offensive tackle, and of course wide receivers and all the other needs on this team. Don't forget the defense. But then if you don't re-sign James Daniels, there's another position that you have to fill with another player. And James Daniels is certainly the one. You know what you're getting, right? Maybe not this coaching staff is still getting to know James Daniels, but like the locker room, the teammates, this organization knows what they're getting from James Daniels. But being a 24-year-old guard on the ascending side of your career is a lucrative time to be hitting free agency, right? That's sort of how it works with these rookie contracts. And so, you look around, I think our friend of the podcast, Brad Spielberger from Over the Cap and Pro Football Focus, he gives a contract projection for James Daniels of 5 years, $50 million. That's obviously then a $10 million average with $24 million guaranteed. And I think that's pretty reasonable projection for what, again, a young ascending offensive lineman, even a guard specifically, will be seeking on this market. And free agency is always tough, right? Because you pay a premium for free agent players that doesn't necessarily fully align with exactly what their value, their ideal value might be. And I really try not to galaxy brain this and overthink this, right? Obviously, like if there's a good player that you really want, you pay him a little bit more, right? I mean, you're willing to pay that slight premium to reward him and to have that in your organization. I think there's a conversation to be had here about whether James Daniels is exactly what they want in terms of building this offensive line around Justin Fields. And this idea of Ryan Poles wanting a tougher, ass-kicking offensive line, like we talk about with Tevin Jenkins standing up for Justin Fields and running over and shoving the defensive player, and then, Jermaine Ifedi in particular pulling Tevin Jenkins off, and how Ryan Poles has basically said he wants more Tevin Jenkinses and fewer Jermaine Ifedis of that style of mentality on his offensive line. And is it unfair to sort of wonder where James Daniels falls in that category? I mean, he hasn't, I'm not trying to say, well, he's soft spoken at press conferences, so therefore he's a soft player. No, I'm not trying to say he's a soft player, but he doesn't necessarily show you that extra level of mean's not quite the right word, because it's not that he's not tough, right? I'm not trying to say James Daniels is not a tough offensive lineman, but you can kind of tell when someone like Tevin Jenkins has a certain attitude about how they play the position and how they carry themselves. And it just feels like maybe James Daniels hasn't quite shown that with the Bears yet. But I think also in his defense, then, the Bears offensive line has not had that mentality as a whole. And perhaps some of that's been coaching and identity for the offense, and that a new offensive line coach and a new offensive identity with the coaching staff could potentially bring that out of him. And maybe he is capable of more of that and being more of an enforcer of an offensive lineman. We just haven't necessarily specifically seen it manifest itself on the field the way Tevin Jenkins was able to come in so quickly and really do that for his team, sometimes for better and for worse, but it's clearly something that Ryan Poles has specifically said he wants a tougher, meaner offensive line that's going to play hard and defend their quarterback. And so the fact that Daniels wasn't doing that only makes me wonder whether or not he's specifically a high priority for them to bring back, right? At the right price, I would absolutely bring him back. But if you're pushing dollar for dollar here, $10 million for him, or you look for another option that might be cheaper, that's maybe more of an enforcer, maybe not quite as great of a player or as consistent or as young or whatever things you might like about James Daniels, but just fits more of that identity of the offensive line, will the Bears potentially value that sort of thing? Because you look at the salaries for guards right now. If say the Brad's projection, which love Brad, and his projections are actually usually really accurate. So let's go with it. Say he's going to get 5 years, $50 million, a $10 million average. That would make him the 10th highest paid guard in the NFL. Is James Daniels the 10th best guard in the NFL? I don't think so. No, I don't think he's, super far from it. I'd put him at a top 20 guard in the NFL. If you think every team has 2 guard starters, so if there's 64 starting guards, is he out of every team, if you include both guards, right? Is he a top 10 guard? I don't know, but top 20, I would think I could put him in that conversation. But the problem is, the 20th highest paid guard in the NFL would make him a about a $5 million salary. So, right, you go from 20 where he plays at to 10 where he would be paid at, and you're literally doubling the salary there. And that's the price you pay for a young free agent who's ascending. You're sort of paying more for the future, and Daniels could continue growing into becoming that top 10 guard and be well worth someday that $50 million contract. But then again, how important is James Daniels to the Bears offensive line and to what the Bears want to do? And if you're taking, you can fudge the numbers a little bit and reduce his year one salary cap hit. So he's not going to take exactly $10 million of the Bears salary cap right now, but say it's five or four, $5-6 million is what he would count on your cap this year out of the 40 million that you have to use right now. Plus you have to sign again, probably 2 wide receivers, sign a center, or I guess maybe draft one, certainly a cornerback you're going to need to address, a safety you're going to have to sign, defensive line, perhaps another linebacker or 2 as you switch to a 4-3. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, do you want to sign James Daniels for $10 million a year? Or do you want to sign, say, a different guard for $5 million a year or whatever it might be, and then have that extra money, whatever salary cap difference that might be in year one, to then go and sign maybe a better cornerback or a better wide receiver that you might not have been able to afford as much had you paid James Daniels, where you start to draw these lines. But again, you also, if you don't re-sign James Daniels, then depending on what you're doing with Cody Whitehair, do you move Cody Whitehair to center and then you need to sign 2 guards? Or do you leave Cody Whitehair at guard and then you have to sign a guard and a center? And where does the draft fit into that? I mean, we'll look at some of the different other options, at least specifically in free agency, maybe mention a draft prospect or 2 on what the Bears' alternatives could be to Daniels and whether or not then you would rather have Daniels or rather have some of these other guys. Next on Locked On Bears. Excuse me. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by the makers of the world's best tasting protein bars, Built Bars. They really do taste like candy bars, and I don't use it lightly when I say the best tasting protein bars I've ever had. I have tried quite a variety of them over my years of working out and trying to get as much protein as I can and trying to find something that actually tastes good and is good for me. And Built Bars is the first thing that has really fully taken both of those things home. I found some things that taste pretty good but are really high in sugar and calories. I've found some things that are really high protein, but they just don't taste very good. But Built Bars have 130 calories, only 4 grams of sugar, 4 grams of carbs, and 17 grams of protein. And yet they're soft and chewy. They're delicious, covered in 100% real chocolate, and they come in a bunch of different great flavors. I've been enjoying the raspberry Built Bars as of late. It's the box I've got in my pantry right now, and I'm getting close to time to reorder. If you're looking to get in and order yourself, use the same promo code that I use, LOCKED15. They're going to give you 15% off your next order, and that's a promo code that you can reuse. I've used it now probably more times than I'd like me to. LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. James Daniels is certainly the known quantity for the Chicago Bears, and certainly I think then a lower risk option at guard and a certain consistency that you know what you're going to get with James Daniels. But there's other players, at least for now, set to hit the free agent market that might provide alternatives that are not as, say, young and growing as Daniels, or maybe not as 4 years of, or I guess 3 years of consistency as James Daniels, but could be maybe slightly more affordable and maybe also fit more of the mentality that you're looking for from a guard. Again, I'm not trying to unfairly say definitively that Daniels doesn't have that, because we just because we haven't necessarily seen it doesn't mean he's not really capable of it. And again, I'm willing to sort of say coaching staff and locker room dynamics and how that offensive line was sort of built maybe was contributing to that. But regardless, other options could be more intriguing to say, let's go maybe a little bit cheaper at that guard to still get a player that's pretty good, maybe not quite as young and ascending as James Daniels, but still pretty good, and then use that money to go elsewhere. Some names, we talked about this a little bit, what would have been last week, Monday or Tuesday. We looked at Chicago Bears' top free agent targets, and we looked at more so some of the bigger names, on the offensive line, like, for example, Brandon Scherf from the Washington Commanders now. He's going to get more money than James Daniels, right? That's not a money-saving move. But you could make the argument that, say Say you move Cody Whitehair to center, you let James Daniels walk, and you spend that James Daniels Scherf to have a lockdown Pro Bowl guard on that side. I mean, he's one of the best all-around guards in the NFL. And then you could go cheaper at another guard spot, as the other spot, or even you could consider bringing a tackle and moving Larry Borum to guard, or you could draft a guard. I mean, there's a possibility there where you could swap Daniels for Scherf, understanding that it's not going to save you money. But if the idea is that, well, maybe Daniels would cost more than the Bears may want to invest in that guard position, given other needs on this roster, a couple of guys that could be a little bit more affordable that are still good. They're just maybe not, again, as young and ascending. Like Laken Tomlinson from the 49ers. I think we mentioned him briefly as just sort of in passing in the Free Agent Target podcast because I think he just turned 30 years old. And he's been the 49ers starter for like 3 or 4 years now and just really solid out of that, like that Kyle Shanahan stretch zone offense in San Francisco that the Bears are trying to build here. So it would be a natural fit for him to kind of come over. And not that he's going to be drastically cheaper necessarily than James Daniels, but you're thinking probably a bit less guaranteed money. So the books are going to be, or the money's going to be a little bit easier to roll around because he is 30 and he's more in this, second contract, or I guess sort of second after the rookie contract. So third contract type stage of his career. Still going to be very consistent, but maybe not quite going to get the 24-year-old bump that James Daniels maybe. Maybe we're looking more like $8 or $9 million a year, but less guaranteed. So you could have less of that money in year one to free up more money to then go elsewhere on your roster. And again, scheme fit and all that would make it, I think, a pretty easy transition to Chicago. Another name we've floated out there, but not necessarily as sexy, Connor Williams from the Dallas Cowboys. He's also young. I think he's about to be 25, but he's been a little bit inconsistent in his career. He was an early pick for them and had some higher expectations and wasn't quite there the first couple of seasons. But the last 2 years, I think he's really sort of settled in a little bit more, particularly in the run blocking game. He moves really well in those, again, some of the outside zone and zone stuff. It's not exactly the Shanahan stuff that the lefty quarterback, the offensive coordinator for the Cowboys, why can't I think of his name? The BYU kid. I'll think of it in a few minutes as I'm sort of still talking through it here. But in that offense, in the Cowboys offense, right? It's not exactly the same as what Kyle Shanahan is doing, but it is similar types of zone heavy running game that he would translate to here. It seems like Connor Williams is, maybe a little bit less consistent in pass protection as like Kellen Moore. Geez, Kellen Moore is the Cowboys offensive coordinator. I knew the name was Kellen, something was in my head and it took me a second. Kellen Moore's offensive system, not quite Shanahan's or Luke Getsy's, but similar type of fit there. But I think given that he's had a little bit less consistency overall and is maybe not as good of a pass blocker as James Daniels, he might be even a little bit cheaper than him or Laken Tomlinson. Maybe, again, I'm not as good on the numbers as like Brad Spielberger is, but $5-6 million a year for a guard that's going to be more in that 20 to 25 range instead of James Daniels in that 15 to 20 range. Like in terms of like ranking in the NFL for a significantly lesser price, I can get a player that's produced at just a slightly lesser production at guard. I mean, some other names to keep eye on there, like Austin Corbett from the Rams. Again, similar tree of system of this McVay Shanahan style of tree and offense, but he's been, I would say, good, but not great the last couple of seasons for them. I'm not wowed by Austin Corbett, but he would get the job done. And again, I don't think it would cost quite as much as James Daniels, given just sort of where they are in their careers. Or like, and a veteran like, Andrew Nora from the Jacksonville Jaguars, maybe like a Trey Turner from the Pittsburgh Steelers. I mean, some of these guys that have had some inconsistencies. Mark Lewinsky from the Colts, if you want to have the Matt Eberflus connection right there. Those are all like options of quality starting level guards that maybe aren't as good as James Daniels, but still very good and will cost $2 to $3 to $4 million less per year when it's all said and done. And that adds up to $2 to $3 to $4 million per year to send at a better wide receiver, a better cornerback, a better linebacker. So for me, I think with Daniels, it comes down to how much better do I really think he is than these other players, and do I really feel like I need to have him as a part of my offensive line? And then also B, do I think he fits the mentality of the offensive line that I want? And I don't think we can answer that question outside the organization. I think it's a conversation Ryan Poles needs to have with the offensive line coach Chris Morgan, and have the conversation with Matt Eberflus and probably with James Daniels, and kind of get a sense of like, okay, can you be the type of mauler and tough, mean, nasty offensive lineman? Not that he's not tough, not that he's soft, but just they want a certain meanness. Can he be that? Do they believe he can be that? And we can't tell from the outside. And those are some of the questions I think that surround James Daniels, in addition to just like financially, how much do you want to invest in that guard position? Are you going to move Cody Whitehair or not? And then therefore, how good of a center could you get for that same amount of money? Right? There's a lot of different moving parts here with Daniels, and why I think it's such an interesting conversation. I get the impression that maybe it's not going to happen, but I don't know. This one's as 50-50 of a return. Like, right, we kind of get the sense that another guy we'll talk about, Allen Robinson or some of these other Bears free agents, Jimmy Graham, we can kind of get a sense of those guys maybe less likely to be back. But some of the other free agents, you can kind of pretty tell, like, yeah, they're almost certainly going to be back. And Daniels is one of these that I'm much more torn in the middle of, like, prediction. Like if someone asked me, gun to my head, is James Daniels a Bear in 2022? That's tough, man. I really don't know how much they value him. It wouldn't surprise me if he was, and it wouldn't stun me if they ended up going in another direction. Curious to know what you think. Do you want the Bears to re-sign James Daniels? Do you think he's worth the investment? Would you rather see them just kind of start something a little bit more fresh there? Or do you want Cody Whitehair at center or guard? What's your plan for the interior of this Bears offensive line? Let me know in the YouTube comments here on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, certainly in the Locked On Bears Facebook group. There's always more Bears talk going on, or of course on Twitter at Locked On Bears. So many different ways to join in this conversation. Thanks for listening every day, making Locked On Bears your first listen today and every day. I hope you're subscribed. I hope you're a part of the conversations around not only the podcast and the show, but the team and the Bears. I think being able to make it much more of a community and a collaboration and the communication surrounding all of that, I think makes it just that much easier for you to bear down.